My name is Evan Carter. I am 46 years old. For 20 of those years, I served in the United States Marine Corps, Force Reconnaissance. After I retired, I wanted something quiet, something that let me use my skills in mapping and land navigation without the constant threat assessment that had become second nature. I became a licensed land surveyor. It was good work. It kept me outdoors, in the mountains and forests of western Montana where I had made my home. I was competent in that environment. I was comfortable. I understood its rules, its rhythms, and its dangers. At least, I thought I did. What I am about to tell you is the reason I no longer go into the deep woods. It is the reason I sold my rifles, moved to the edge of town, and can't stand the sound of a dog barking after sundown. This happened 3 years ago, in late October. The aspens had already shed their gold, leaving skeletal white branches against the dark pines. There was a bite in the air that promised the first heavy snow was not far off. It was the perfect time for the annual elk hunt. It was more than just a hunt for me and my friends. It was a tradition, a ritual. A week of disconnecting from the world and reconnecting with something more fundamental. There were 4 of us that year. There was me. There was Calvin Riley. We had served together for a decade. He was a man you could build a house on, steady, quiet, and profoundly capable. If I was the navigator, he was the anchor. Then there was his cousin Brian. Brian was the opposite of Cal. He was loud, full of jokes that were never quite as funny as he thought, and he treated the wilderness like a theme park built for his amusement. He was a decent shot, but his lack of patience and reverence for the woods always set my teeth on edge. The 4th was Jake, a kid from Cal's new neighborhood, only about 22. He was eager, respectful, and a little green. Cal had taken him under his wing. We were heading deep into the Bitterroot National Forest, to a spot I had scouted during a survey job the year before. It was remote, accessible only by a long, rutted-out logging road that hadn't been maintained in years. That was the appeal. No other hunters, no weekend campers, just us and the mountain. The drive in took the better part of 3 hours after we left the pavement. My truck, a heavy-duty 4-wheel drive, groaned and complained as we crawled over washouts and dodged fallen logs. Brian, of course, was chattering the whole way. He was going on about some reality television show he'd been watching, something about survivalists. "You guys think we'll see a Bigfoot?" he'd asked, slapping his knee. "I brought my special Bigfoot call." He then proceeded to let out a series of whooping noises that sounded more like a sick goose than anything else. Cal, who was driving, didn't even turn his head. "Shut up, Brian. You'll scare the squirrels." Jake, in the back with me, just smiled nervously. He was watching the dense forest slide past the window, his eyes wide. To him, this was a grand adventure. To me and Cal, it was just coming home. I remember the smell as I rolled down my window. It was crisp and clean, a mix of pine needles, damp earth, and the cold, mineral scent of rock. The air was thin up here, close to 6,000 feet. It felt pure. It felt safe. We made camp in a small clearing I had picked out, a flat piece of ground surrounded by a thick stand of lodgepole pines with a clear, fast-running creek about 50 yards away. It was an ideal spot. Good cover, fresh water, and a natural fire break. We went about our tasks with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this 100 times before. Cal and I set up the main canvas tent, a big, sturdy outfitter model that could withstand a blizzard. Brian and Jake were on firewood duty. The sounds were all normal. The rhythmic chop of the axe, the rustle of our gear, the murmur of the creek. Birds called from the trees. A raven cawed from a high branch, watching us with intelligent black eyes. Everything was as it should be. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, we had a good fire going. The flames crackled and popped, spitting embers into the darkening air. We sat around it in our camp chairs, drinking coffee laced with a little bit of whiskey to ward off the chill. Brian was telling a story about a fishing trip, waving his hands around. Cal was quietly cleaning his rifle, a Winchester Model 70 in .30-06, the same rifle his father had used. I was just watching the flames, feeling the tension of the city and the job drain out of me. This was the moment I always looked forward to, the quiet descent of night in a place where the only clock was the sun and the only laws were those of nature. Then the first wrong thing happened. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was the opposite. It was a sudden and complete absence of sound. One moment, the forest was alive with the background hum of insects, the chirping of late-calling birds, the gentle sigh of the wind in the pines. The next, it was gone. Total, absolute silence. The kind of silence that feels heavy, like a blanket being pressed down over the world. It was so abrupt that Brian stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open. "Whoa," he said, his voice suddenly small. "Did you guys hear that?" "Hear what?" Jake asked, looking around, his brow furrowed. "I don't hear anything." "Exactly," I said, slowly scanning the tree line beyond the ring of firelight. The fire itself seemed unnaturally loud in the vacuum. Even the creek sounded muted, distant.
Cal had stopped cleaning his rifle. He was frozen, his head cocked, listening. His eyes met mine across the fire, and I saw the same question in them. This wasn't right. In all my years in the woods, I had never experienced a silence so profound, so sudden. Animals might quiet down if a predator is near, but even then, there's always something. The wind, insects. The world doesn't just turn off. "Probably just a temperature inversion or something," Brian said, trying to reclaim his bravado. "Weird mountain acoustics." He was trying to rationalize it, to put it in a box he could understand. But his voice was strained. The silence had unnerved him too. The silence held for maybe 5 minutes, though it felt like an hour. We sat there, frozen, listening to nothing. The fire crackled, a lonely sound in a dead world. Then, as suddenly as it had stopped, the sound returned. A soft breeze whispered through the branches. The insects started their nightly chorus again, and the forest was alive once more. We all let out a collective breath we didn't realize we'd been holding. "See? Weird," Brian said, laughing a little too loudly. "Mountain ghosts." Cal didn't laugh. He slowly resumed wiping down the barrel of his rifle, but his movements were different now. Tighter, more deliberate. He kept glancing up at the dark wall of trees that surrounded us. The feeling of peace I'd had was gone, replaced by a low-grade hum of anxiety. Something had passed through or near our camp. Something big enough to make the entire forest hold its breath. Later that night, as we were banking the fire and getting ready to turn in, we heard another sound. This one was not an absence, but a presence. It came from deep in the woods, maybe half a mile away, up the slope of the mountain. It was a series of heavy, rhythmic thuds. Thump, thump. Pause. Thump, thump. It sounded like a giant was methodically hitting a tree with a massive club. It was too slow and too powerful for an animal. It was too rhythmic for a rockfall. "What in the hell is that?" Jake whispered, his face pale in the light of his headlamp. "Could be a woodpecker," Brian offered, though he didn't sound convinced. "A really, really big one." "No woodpecker makes a sound like that," Cal said, his voice a low growl. He was staring into the darkness in the direction of the sound. "It sounds like someone chopping wood." "At this time of night? Half a mile up a mountain with no trail?" I countered. "And listen to the rhythm. It's not the rhythm of chopping." It was a deliberate, almost conversational pattern. 2 beats, a pause, 2 beats. It went on for about a minute,
then stopped. We waited, listening, but it didn't return. We tried to explain it away. An echo from a distant logging operation, even though we knew we were miles from any active site. A geological phenomenon.
Brian, grasping for straws, even suggested it was a moose rubbing its antlers against a tree. But we all knew that wasn't right either. The sound was too sharp, too concussive. We eventually gave up and went to our sleeping bags, but sleep did not come easily for me. I lay there in the dark, listening to the normal sounds of the forest, trying to convince myself that they were the only sounds. But the memory of that suffocating silence, followed by those impossible heavy thuds, had planted a seed of deep unease in my mind. The mountain was watching us, and I was no longer sure we were welcome. The next morning broke clear and cold. A thin layer of frost coated everything, sparkling in the early sunlight. The strangeness of the night before felt less immediate in the light of day. We made breakfast, the familiar smells of coffee and frying bacon helping to restore a sense of normalcy. Brian was back to his usual self, making jokes about how we were all spooked by a phantom lumberjack. But Cal and I were quiet. We went about our morning chores with a new kind of awareness, our eyes constantly scanning the trees, our ears tuned for anything out of the ordinary. After we ate, Cal and I went to investigate the area where we thought the sounds had come from. Just to be sure, he'd said, and I'd agreed. We left Brian and Jake to tidy up the camp, telling them not to wander off. We moved up the slope, rifles slung over our shoulders. It was steep, difficult terrain, covered in deadfall and thick underbrush. There was no trail. No one would come up here for a casual stroll. We didn't find the source of the knocking, no freshly chopped trees or disturbed ground. But we did find something else. On a patch of damp earth near a game trail, we found a series of tracks. They stopped us cold. I knelt down, my heart starting to beat a little faster. The print was massive, at least 16 inches long. It was elongated, like a canine track, with 4 distinct toe pads and a large heel pad. But the similarities ended there. The claws, or what looked like claw marks, were too long and sharp. The track was pressed impossibly deep into the firm ground, suggesting an immense weight, and the shape was just wrong. It had the basic layout of a paw, but it was narrower, more like a distorted human foot. Cal knelt beside me. "Grizzly?" he murmured, but he didn't believe it. Neither did I. I've seen hundreds of grizzly tracks. They are wide, round, with a distinct curved line of toe impressions. This was not that. "Look at the stride," I said, pointing to the next track. It was a good 7 feet away from the first, and the next was another 7 feet from that. The prints were in a straight line, one directly in front of the other. It wasn't a 4-legged gait. It was bipedal. Something huge had walked here on 2 legs. We followed the track line for about 50 yards. It moved with an unnerving purpose, straight through the dense woods, not around obstacles, but seemingly over them. We saw where a rotten log as thick as my thigh had been snapped in 2, right in the path of the tracks. Not pushed aside, snapped. We looked at each other. The easy explanations were gone. This wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person. My mind, trained to identify, categorize, and assess threats, was coming up empty. It was like trying to solve an equation where one of the numbers was simply impossible. We returned to camp, sober and silent. We showed Brian and Jake the photos I had taken of the prints on my phone. Brian's jokes died on his lips. He stared at the screen, his face paling. "What the hell is that?" "We don't know," Cal said. His voice was flat. "But whatever it is, it's big, and it was close to camp last night." Jake looked terrified. Should we leave?" It was the logical question. Every instinct I had, honed by years of survival in hostile environments, was screaming at me that we were in the wrong place.
We were trespassing. But there was another part of us, the part that had driven 3 hours up a mountain to hunt elk, the part that refused to be scared off by strange noises and funny-looking tracks. It was pride. It was stubbornness. "We'll be careful," Cal decided, his jaw set. "We stick together. No one goes off alone. We'll hunt today, keep our eyes open, and if anything else happens, we pack up." Brian, surprisingly, argued for leaving. The bravado had completely evaporated, replaced by a raw, primal fear. "Cal, man, this is not right. Did you see the size of that thing? Let's just go. We can come back next year." But Cal, once he made up his mind, was immovable.
And I, fool that I was, backed him up. He's right. We're 4 men with high-powered rifles. We're not going to be run off by a shadow. We'll be smart about it. We'll hunt the lower valley, away from where we found those tracks. We'll be back at camp well before dusk. It was a compromise, a foolish one. We were trying to impose our own rules on a situation that clearly operated by a different set of them entirely. We decided to hunt in pairs, Cal with Brian and me with Jake. It felt safer that way. We geared up, the mood entirely different from the excited anticipation of a normal hunt. Now, it felt like a patrol. Every snap of a twig, every call of a bird made us jump. The forest no longer felt neutral. It felt hostile. Jake and I moved slowly through the timber heading east, away from the slope where we'd found the prints. Jake was jumpy, his head on a swivel.
I tried to keep him focused. "Watch for sign, Jake. Keep your eyes on the ground, not just the trees." But I was doing the same thing, my gaze constantly drawn to the dark spaces between the pines, expecting to see something looking back. For a few hours, things felt almost normal. We found some fresh elk sign and began to track a small herd. The focus of the hunt temporarily pushed the unease to the back of my mind. The sun was warm on our backs, and the familiar cadence of tracking, the quiet communication, the careful footfalls, was soothing. We were hunters again, not prey. Then we found the deer. We smelled it first, the coppery, gut-wrenching stench of a fresh kill. It was lying in a small clearing, or what was left of it. It was a large doe, and it had been utterly destroyed. This was not the work of a mountain lion or a bear. A cougar kills cleanly, usually with a bite to the neck, and often covers its kill to come back later.
A bear will feed messily, but there's a pattern to it. This was different. This was violence. The doe's neck was broken, her head twisted at an impossible angle. Her entire rib cage had been ripped open, the ribs not just broken but snapped outwards, like someone had pried the chest apart with incredible force. The internal organs were gone, but it wasn't the work of a scavenger. It was too clean. The surrounding ground was soaked in blood, but there were no drag marks, no signs of a struggle. It was as if the animal had simply been standing there one moment and been annihilated the next. Jake made a gagging sound and turned away. I walked closer, my rifle held at a low ready. I looked for tracks, for any sign of what had done this. I found nothing. The ground was covered in a thick mat of pine needles that had absorbed any impressions, but as I circled the carcass, I saw something that made the blood run cold in my veins.
A few feet away, propped against the base of a pine tree, was the deer's head. It had been severed from the body. It was placed deliberately, facing the carcass, its dead eyes staring at the ruin of its own body. This wasn't a predator. This was an executioner. This was a message. "We're leaving," I said, my voice hoarse. I grabbed Jake by the arm. He was shaking, his face the color of ash. "We're going back to camp, now." We didn't run, but our pace back to camp was urgent. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat.
I felt 1,000 unseen eyes on my back. The feeling of being watched was no longer a vague premonition, it was a certainty. Whatever had done that to the deer was here. It was close, and it knew we were here too. The psychological aspect of it was what terrified me the most. The silence, the knocking, the tracks, the grotesque display with the deer's head. It wasn't just an animal behaving on instinct. It was intelligent. It was malevolent. And it was toying with us.
When we got back to camp, Cal and Brian were already there. They hadn't seen anything, but our story and the pictures I'd taken of the doe solidified the decision. No one argued this time. The hunt was over. We were in a race against the setting sun. We began to break down camp with a frantic, desperate energy. Tents were collapsed without being properly folded. Sleeping bags were stuffed into sacks. Cooking gear was thrown into boxes. Every minute we spent there felt like a minute borrowed on stolen time. As the sun dipped below the western ridge, plunging the valley into deep shadow, the woods went silent again. The same oppressive, suffocating silence from the night before. This time, it was not a mystery. It was a harbinger, a dinner bell. "Hurry," Cal grunted, throwing a heavy duffel bag into the bed of my truck. "Get the rest of the gear. I'll get the cab unlocked." And then we heard it. A low growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once.
It wasn't the growl of a bear or a wolf. It was deeper, more guttural. It vibrated up through the soles of our boots, a resonant, chest-rattling sound that bypassed the ears and went straight to the spine. We all froze, looking around wildly. The sound was close, frighteningly close. From the dense stand of pines on the far side of the clearing, a figure emerged. The partial reveal we'd had the night before was nothing compared to this. It stepped out of the shadows and into the twilight, and my mind simply refused to process what I was seeing. It was tall, easily 7.5, maybe 8 feet. It stood on 2 long, powerfully muscled legs that were bent like a dog's, with reversed knees. Its body was a grotesque fusion of man and beast, with massive, broad shoulders and a narrow waist. It was covered in coarse, matted fur the color of charcoal and dead leaves. But the arms were the worst part. They were too long for its body, hanging down almost to its knees. They ended in what I can only describe as hands, large, 5-fingered hands, but tipped with thick, black claws that looked like they could tear through steel. And then it raised its head. It was the head of a wolf or a large dog, a German shepherd perhaps, but monstrously oversized. A long snout filled with yellowed fangs, lips pulled back in a silent snarl. But the eyes were what broke me. They were not the eyes of an animal. They were intelligent. They were a pale, luminous yellow, and they glowed with a malevolent, calculating light. They scanned our camp, taking in the truck, the scattered gear, and each of us, one by one. It was sizing us up, assessing. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. There was only the creature, a silent, impossible statue of nightmare fuel, and the 4 of us, paralyzed by a terror so profound it was almost sublime. Brian made a small, choked sound, a whimper. It was the only sound in the dead silent world. The creature's head snapped towards him, its focus locked on. And then it moved. It didn't run. It didn't charge. It flowed across the clearing with an unnatural, terrifying grace. It covered the 30 yards between the tree line and our camp in a handful of loping, silent strides. It was impossibly fast. My training, buried under layers of civilian life, kicked in. "Rifles!"
I screamed, fumbling for the .300 Winchester Magnum that was leaning against the truck's tire. Cal was already moving, bringing his own rifle up. Jake stood frozen, his eyes wide with disbelief and horror. Brian just stood there, his face a mask of slack-jawed terror. He had completely shut down. The creature ignored Cal and me. It went straight for Brian. It didn't slow down. It reached him, and one of its long arms lashed out. It wasn't a swipe. It was a grab. The clawed hand closed around Brian's chest, and it lifted him off the ground as if he weighed nothing.
Brian let out one single, high-pitched scream that was cut off with a sickening, wet crunch. The creature turned, still holding him, and bounded back towards the tree line in 2 effortless strides. And then it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Brian was gone. The whole thing took less than 5 seconds. The silence that followed was more terrible than anything that had come before. It was a silence filled with the echo of that scream and the image of that impossible speed and strength. Jake finally broke. He started screaming, a high, thin wail of pure, undiluted panic. Cal grabbed him by the front of his jacket. "Shut up! Shut up right now! Get in the truck!" But the creature wasn't done with us. We heard a deafening crash of metal tearing. I spun around. A second one. A second one had come from the other side of the clearing. It was standing by the driver's side of my truck. As I watched, it hooked its claws into the top of the doorframe and peeled the entire door off the vehicle, tossing it aside like it was made of cardboard. It then ducked its head inside the cab, and there was a sound of shattering glass and ripping upholstery. It was disabling our escape. This wasn't a wild animal attack. This was a coordinated, intelligent assault. They were flanking us. They were neutralizing our vehicle. They were hurting us. "Forget the truck," Cal yelled, his voice strained but steady. He was a rock. Even in this madness, he was a rock. "Back to back, watch the trees." I scrambled to his side, chambering around. Jake was on the ground, curled into a ball, sobbing. He was useless. It was just me and Cal, back in the dance, just like old times. But the enemy was something from a madman's fever dream. We stood in the dying light, in the center of our ruined camp, rifles up, turning in a slow circle. We could hear them moving in the darkness that now fully encircled us. Heavy bodies crashing through the undergrowth. Low growls that seemed to vibrate in our bones. They were circling, staying just beyond the effective range of our vision. They were patient. They were hunters, and they knew they had their prey trapped. Then, a rock the size of a bowling ball flew out of the darkness and slammed into the hood of my truck with a deafening bang, leaving a massive crater in the steel. They were using tools. They were trying to flush us out, to make us panic and run. "Don't fire wild," Cal said, his voice a low command right next to my ear. "Conserve your ammo. Wait for a clear shot." Another rock came flying, this one smashing through the truck's rear window. Jake screamed again. I saw movement to my left, a dark shape detaching itself from the deeper shadows of the pines. "Contact! Left flank!" I yelled, bringing my rifle to my shoulder. I found the shape in my scope. It was one of them, crouched low, its yellow eyes glowing like demonic lanterns in the gloom. I centered the crosshairs on its chest, took a breath, and squeezed the trigger. The report of the .300 Magnum was deafening in the silence. The rifle bucked hard against my shoulder. The creature let out a guttural howl, a sound of pain and fury, and staggered back, clutching at its shoulder. I had hit it, a good hit. But it didn't go down. It looked at the wound, then looked back at me, and the hatred in its eyes was a physical force.
It snarled, bearing a mouthful of fangs, and then melted back into the trees. "It's wounded," I shouted to Cal. "I hit it." But there was no time for celebration. The one I had shot had been a distraction. While my attention was focused on it, the other one charged. It came from the right, a blur of dark fur and murderous intent. It was on Cal before he could even turn. He got a single shot off, a panicked, unaimed blast that went wide.
Then the creature was on him. It didn't grab him like it had Brian. It slammed into him like a freight train. Cal, a man of 220 pounds of solid muscle, was thrown backward 10 feet, his rifle flying from his hands. He hit the ground with a sickening thud. The creature stood over him, its massive form silhouetted against the last vestiges of twilight. It lowered its head, its long snout sniffing at Cal's still form. I screamed Cal's name and raised my rifle, but I didn't have a clear shot. The creature's body was shielding him. I started to circle, trying to get an angle, my heart hammering against my ribs. I was going to lose him. I was going to lose my brother. Then Jake moved. I don't know if it was bravery or just blind panic, but he scrambled to his feet and ran. He didn't run towards the woods or away from the creatures. He ran towards Cal's discarded rifle, which lay on the ground halfway between him and the monster. The creature's head snapped up.
It had been so focused on Cal that it hadn't paid the sobbing boy any mind. Now, it saw a new threat, or maybe just a new target. It let out a low growl and took a step towards Jake. "Jake, no!" I yelled. He didn't listen. He scooped up the rifle. He didn't know how to use it properly. He fumbled with it, trying to shoulder it. The creature took another long, loping step. It was 10 feet from him. It unhinged its jaw and let out a roar that shook the very ground, a blast of sound and fury and the smell of rot and old blood. That roar was my chance. The creature was distracted, focused entirely on Jake. I had a clear shot at its side, its exposed torso. I didn't hesitate. I put the crosshairs just behind its shoulder and fired. The bullet struck home with a wet, meaty smack. The creature shuddered, its roar cut short in a choked grunt. It twisted, its glowing yellow eyes finding mine again. It took a staggering step towards me, one clawed hand reaching out. Then its legs, those wrong-jointed, powerful legs, buckled. It crashed to the ground, landing with a heavy, final thud, not 5 feet from where I stood. It was dead. But the fight wasn't over. From the tree line, a chorus of howls erupted. Not just one, not two. It sounded like a dozen of them. The one I had wounded earlier was answering them, its pained howls mixing with the others. We had killed one of their pack, and they were furious. Cal was groaning, trying to push himself up. His arm was bent at a wrong angle, broken. Jake was standing over the dead creature, shaking, still holding Cal's rifle. "We have to go," I gasped, grabbing Cal and hauling him to his feet. He cried out in pain but leaned on me. "Jake, let's go, move." The howling was getting closer. They were coming, all of them. There was no time to think, no time to plan. There was only flight. I half-dragged, half-carried Cal, stumbling away from the ruined campsite and the dead monster, away from the wreck of my truck, and plunged into the dark woods. Jake followed close behind, clutching the rifle like a talisman. Our flight was a blind, stumbling panic. We had no lights, no compass, only the desperate, primal instinct to put as much distance as possible between us and the howling. We ran through the pitch-black forest, tripping over roots, crashing through brush, branches whipping at our faces. The sounds of pursuit were behind us, the heavy footfalls, the snapping branches, the enraged howls that echoed through the valley. I don't know how long we ran. It could have been minutes or hours. Time had lost all meaning. There was only the burning in my lungs, the agonizing weight of Cal on my shoulder, and the terror that spurred us on. Cal was barely conscious, moaning with every jarring step. Jake was making small, whimpering sounds behind me. At one point, I risked a glance over my shoulder. I saw them, far behind us, moving through the trees, not running, but loping, keeping pace. Their yellow eyes were like floating embers in the darkness, a constellation of death that was tracking our every move. They weren't in a hurry. They were herding us, driving us. But where? We broke out of the timber and onto a steep shale slide. The loose rock shifted under our feet. I lost my footing, and Cal and I went down in a heap. We slid 20 feet down the sharp rock before slamming into a small cluster of stunted pines. The pain was excruciating. My knee was twisted, and my hands were shredded from the shale. Cal was unconscious. I lay there, gasping for air, the taste of blood in my mouth. I could hear them above us, on the edge of the slide. They were chuffing and growling, the sounds of their strange, guttural language echoing in the night. They weren't coming down the slide. They were waiting. I looked at Jake. He was huddled against a tree, his face a mess of tears and dirt. "They've got us," he whispered. "They've got us trapped." I thought he was right. This was the end. They had driven us into a corner. But then I heard it. Faintly from far below us in the valley, the sound of an engine. A heavy diesel engine, the grinding gears of a large truck. It was the loggers. They sometimes ran their trucks at night to get an early start. It was a 1,000,000-to-1 shot, but it was the only shot we had. "Down," I croaked, pointing down the mountain. "We have to get down to the road." I grabbed Cal again, ignoring the shooting pain in my own body, and started scrambling, sliding, and falling down the rest of the shale slope. Jake followed. The creatures above us howled in frustration. They didn't seem to want to follow us onto the open, unstable ground. Maybe they feared the noise, or maybe their weight was too great for the loose rock. I didn't know or care. We just kept going down.
We reached the bottom of the slide and crashed back into the tree line. The logging road was close now. I could see the faint glow of headlights through the trees. We pushed through one last thick stand of firs and tumbled out onto the gravel road. A massive logging truck was grinding its way up the grade, its headlights carving a brilliant white tunnel through the darkness. I stumbled into the middle of the road, waving my arms. Jake was right behind me. The truck's air brakes hissed violently as the driver slammed them on, the massive vehicle skidding to a halt not 20 feet from us. The driver's door flew open, and a big man in a flannel shirt leaned out, his face a mixture of anger and shock. "What in God's name are you doing in the middle of the road?" Then he saw the state of us. Me, covered in blood and dirt, supporting my unconscious and clearly injured friend. Jake, pale and shaking, clutching a rifle. His anger vanished, replaced by alarm. "My God, son, what happened to you? A bear?" "Bear," I gasped, the lie coming easily. It was the only word that made sense. "A big one, attacked our camp. Our friend is gone." The story tumbled out of us in a disjointed, hysterical mess as the logger and his partner helped us get Cal into the cab. We didn't tell them the truth. We couldn't. How could you explain what we had seen? We talked about a grizzly, a freakishly large and aggressive one that had ambushed us at dusk. They listened with grim, sympathetic faces. They had heard stories of problem bears before. Our tale, while horrific, fit into a recognizable category of wilderness danger. The truth did not. They drove us down the mountain, the radio crackling as they called in the incident. We left the howls and the yellow eyes and the impossible monsters behind us, descending back into the world of men and logic and easy explanations.
But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my soul, that we weren't really leaving it behind. We were taking it with us. The sheriff's department met us at the turnoff to the main highway. We were taken to the small county hospital. Cal had a compound fracture of his humerus and a severe concussion. My knee was badly sprained, and I had dozens of cuts and contusions. Jake was physically unharmed, but in a state of profound shock. He just sat in the waiting room, staring at a wall, not speaking to anyone. I gave my statement to a young, bored-looking deputy. I stuck to the bear story. I told him about our camp's location, about Brian. I tried to make it sound as plausible as possible. The deputy wrote it all down in his little notebook, his expression a mixture of professional sympathy and thinly veiled skepticism.
People who get into trouble in the woods often tell wild stories. "And you shot this bear?" he asked. "Yes," I said, "twice. I think I killed one." I had to correct myself. It. I think I killed it. He raised an eyebrow. "You think you killed one? How many were there?" I hesitated. It was dark, confusing. There was at least one, maybe more. The deputy sighed. "Okay, Mr. Carter. We'll send a team up there at first light. Fish and game, too. See what we can find." They did find it. They found my wrecked truck. They found the tattered remains of our camp. And they found what was left of Brian. The official report, when it was finally released weeks later, listed the cause of death as animal predation, consistent with a large grizzly bear. They found the dead creature, my creature. The report mentioned an unusually large canine carcass found near the site, which they speculated was a wolf or wolf hybrid that had been involved in the bear attack and was killed in the fray.
The carcass, they noted, was degraded and partially scavenged, making positive identification difficult. It was sent to a state lab for analysis. I never heard another word about it. Case closed. No one questioned the official story. It was tragic, but it made sense. A rogue grizzly in a remote area. It happens. It was clean. It was simple. It was a lie. A few days later, as I was being discharged from the hospital, an older man in a fish and game uniform stopped me in the hallway. He was near retirement, his face a roadmap of wrinkles from a life spent in the sun. He introduced himself as Officer Miles. "I was on the team that went up to your camp," he said, his voice low. He looked around to make sure no one was listening. "I saw the tracks you guys photographed, and I saw the animal you shot." I tensed, waiting for the accusation, the disbelief. "I've been working these mountains for 40 years, he continued, his eyes fixed on mine. "I've seen things that don't make the reports, strange tracks, livestock kills that don't add up, people who go into the woods and just don't come out. Every 5 or 10 years we get a story like yours, a story that doesn't quite fit." He paused, letting his words sink in. "The official report is going to say it was a bear. It's easier that way. People understand bears. They don't have to ask questions they don't want the answers to. But you and I know what you saw wasn't a bear." He put a hand on my shoulder. It was a heavy, comforting weight. "I'm not going to ask you what happened up there. I don't want to know. But I'll give you some advice. Stay out of those woods. Some places are older than we are. They have their own rules. You broke one of them. You were lucky to get out alive. Don't press your luck again." And that was it. A quiet, unofficial acknowledgement. A validation that I wasn't crazy, wrapped in a warning to keep my mouth shut. He turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the sterile, brightly lit hallway, the truth of what happened a toxic secret burning in my gut. That was 3 years ago. The physical wounds have healed. My knee still aches when the weather turns cold,
a constant reminder. But the other wounds, the ones you can't see, they don't heal. They fester. Cal moved to Arizona a year after the incident. We don't talk about it. We tried once, on the phone, but the words wouldn't come.
There was just a long, heavy silence, filled with the things we both knew but could never say. We sent each other a text on the anniversary of that night. That's all. Thinking of you. Stay safe. It's enough. I never saw Jake again. I heard he dropped out of college and moved back in with his parents in another state. I hope he found some peace, but I doubt it. You don't walk away from something like that unchanged. I live with the ghost of Brian. I see his face in my nightmares, that look of blank terror just before the creature took him. I carry the guilt of that day, the weight of my own foolish pride that kept us there when we should have run. I was the experienced one. I should have known better. I should have protected them. I can't be in the woods anymore. The silence between the trees is no longer peaceful. It's menacing. Every shadow holds a memory. I sold my surveying business. I work a desk job now, processing permits for the county. It's boring. It's safe.
I look at maps of the mountains I used to love, and all I feel is a cold, hollow dread. I am telling this story because I have to, because the official report is a lie, and the truth is buried in a file somewhere, labeled anomalous canine. I'm telling it for Brian, who became a statistic in a bear attack report, and I'm telling it as a warning. There are things in this world, in the deep, remote places, that we do not understand. Things that are not in any field guide or textbook. They are ancient, intelligent, and they do not like us. People go missing in our national parks every year, hundreds of them, unexplained disappearances. Most are written off as accidents or animal attacks. But how many of them are not? How many of them stumbled into the wrong valley at the wrong time? How many of them heard the woods go silent and didn't know what it meant? So if you ever find yourself deep in the wilderness, far from any road, and that sudden, unnatural quiet descends, don't try to explain it away. Don't be proud. Don't be stubborn. Just leave. Pack your gear and get out as fast as you can, because you are no longer the hunter. You are being hunted, and the things that are watching you from the trees are not just stories. They are real. I know. I met them.